hoping that tracing apps will help us mitigate the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and ultimately help us reopen more safely. But of course, there's still a lot of uncertainty about just how effective these tools will be and how they might impact society at large. Now, at their best, COVID-19 tracing apps might usefully supplement existing public health efforts, like testing, manual contact tracing done by humans, and targeted lockdown measures. But at their worst, these tools might just not be effective enough to actually add a significant benefit to existing public health policies. And even more disturbingly, they might end up eroding important civil rights and liberties and enable governments and private corporations to engage in mass surveillance at an unprecedented scale. So in light of all of that, how worried and how hopeful should we be about implementing these technological tools here and now? My name is Dr. Annette Zimmermann. I'm a political and moral philosopher and an incoming permanent faculty member at the University of York's philosophy department. In my own research, I spent a lot of time thinking about how technological systems and social and political systems interact with each other, and who should have the power to make decisions about that. Now in this video, let's take a closer look at how COVID-19 tracing apps actually work, and how we should think about their role as a democratically legitimate technological tool in combating the spread of COVID-19. So several different technological solutions have been proposed recently, but in this video, we'll focus on a specific form of contact tracing apps. Apps that identify recent contacts by exchanging low-energy Bluetooth signals. Each phone generates a rotating random numerical ID that it broadcasts to nearby devices at specific time intervals. And so other phones will listen to those signals from nearby devices and exchange their IDs as part of a Bluetooth handshake. When somebody tests positive for COVID-19, they can report their test result to the app. So in these cases, the app will send all of the daily keys that it has used in the recent past to a server after the infected user has consented to sharing that data. And then every phone that has the app installed regularly downloads the list of IDs of users that have been tested positive. So the app can then compare that list with the list of IDs it has encountered recently. It's important to note that on the Bluetooth model, we're not tracing location patterns per se. What we're doing is we're tracing an infection chain. So that makes this model different from a GPS location tracking app, which has also been proposed recently. So the GPS location tracking app would gather much more person-specific data and therefore seems much more invasive and less privacy-friendly than the Bluetooth model. Apple and Google have now teamed up to develop an API, so an application programming interface, that app developers can now build on in order to create a tool that is interoperable across a range of different devices. But individual countries have also developed their own contact tracing apps, and those differ from country to country. Okay, let's take a closer look at a concrete example of a contact tracing app. In the UK, the NHS COVID-19 app was piloted on the Isle of Wight in the beginning of May 2020. Now, the UK government had awarded contracts to a number of private corporations to assist in this effort. One of these companies, Palantir, a big data analytics firm which was co-founded by Peter Thiel and which had previously provided services to US military, intelligence, law enforcement, and immigration enforcement, so sectors very different from public health, received a contract charging only £1 for their services. Now, this was revealed in early June, when the UK government disclosed its contracts with major tech companies to Open Democracy, which had threatened legal action against the UK government and demanded more transparency. Now, all of this prompted serious concern by civil rights organizations and journalists about transferring health data of millions of UK citizens to private tech companies, including those with a commercial interest in acquiring data to train and build AI models. Their question was, what are private companies getting out of these government contracts? And is this really in the best interest of citizens? Now, a group of scientists and information security and privacy experts critiqued the UK's plans in an open letter as early as April 2020, citing privacy concerns over the centralized contact tracing model that the UK government had favored until recently. In the letter, they argued that It has been reported that NHSX is discussing an approach which records centrally the de-anonymized ID of someone who is infected and also the ID of all those with whom the infected person has been in contact. This facility would enable a form of surveillance. It is vital that when we come out of the current crisis, we have not created a tool that enables data collection on the population or on targeted sections of society for surveillance. Thus, solutions which allow reconstructing invasive information about individuals must be fully justified. Such invasive information can include the social graph of who someone has physically met over a period of time. With access to the social graph, a bad actor, be it a state, the private sector, or a hacker, could spy on citizens' real-world activities. Now, why worry about this centralized model of contact tracing? After all, both centralized and decentralized contact tracing tools rely on some kind of authority that processes data. Now, the difference is in what the authority, such as a public health agency, actually knows. In the centralized model, the authority knows enough to contact the people who may have been nearby a person who has tested positive. So this includes data about interpersonal associations, which of course can be quite sensitive. Now, in the decentralized model, such as the ones built on Apple's and Google's API, app users exchange their IDs directly without storing them on a centralized database. It's a peer-to-peer model. Of course, ultimately, no technological solution can guarantee ultimate privacy. But it is important to emphasize that centralized models rely on one crucial assumption: the view that one central authority can be trusted to keep vast amounts of data secure and will not misuse it. In many places, depending on the political landscape, that assumption might be a dangerous assumption to make. Now, in a surprising turn of events, the BBC reported on June 18 that the UK government has decided to abandon the NHS tracing app relying on a centralized database and instead switch to the opposite alternative, the decentralized Apple-Google model. Given that these developments are underway, let's return to our original question. Should we be using tracing apps, and why? Now, there is a common tech optimist view. That view is, well, innovation requires trial and error. So we don't know if tracing apps will work perfectly, but let's just give them a try. And in a way that's true, thanks to the UK piloting its old centralized app on the Isle of Wight in May, we now know how badly it worked on some operating systems. The Guardian reported recently that that app recognized only 4% of iPhones. It worked better on other devices, but for iPhones, its accuracy was severely limited. And so it looks like we're still in a situation characterized by pretty deep uncertainty here. Never before have we really tried to mitigate the spread of an ongoing global pandemic via digital tracing tools. So implementing them in an ethically and politically justifiable way will require a careful assessment of potential risks and benefits. And of course, we have to remember that if there is a lot of uncertainty about the effectiveness and accuracy of tracing apps, this may well erode trust in society and make it less likely that a lot of people will voluntarily download the app. But let's assume that some company, research team, or a country can, over time, develop a tracing app that does work sufficiently well. So the ethical case in favor of implementing that app seems pretty clear, right? Well, I would argue not so fast. Accuracy isn't everything. We have to remember that no highly accurate contact tracing app in whatever form will help us beat the pandemic on its own. An accurate app that works well takes us only this far. Tracing apps, much like manual tracing policies, still need to be accompanied by comprehensive and frequent testing efforts and other public health policies. In addition, a technological tool might be accurate, but it might still be morally and politically objectionable to use it for reasons unrelated to accuracy. This is a common problem with a range of different emerging technologies, from big data analytics to machine learning tools. We can't just ask, does this tool work accurately? We also have to ask, are we using this accurate tool for the right purpose? Are there any costs despite the benefits of accuracy? Now, in the context of tracing apps, for example, if it turns out that the decentralized apps are less accurate than centralized ones, but decentralized apps are more privacy friendly, we are faced with this really important normative trade-off. It isn't immediately obvious whether we should prioritize privacy rights or accuracy here. Choosing one over the other will have serious normative consequences in either case. Now, you might think that in a public health emergency, we should be more willing to compromise on privacy and other rights and liberties, and just prioritize accuracy and safety instead. Now, in this view, even a highly invasive tracing app that might ultimately allow for significant surveillance seems to be morally and politically permissible if it helps us mitigate the spread of the pandemic. But I would argue fundamental rights are called fundamental precisely because we don't think of them as something that can easily be infringed upon, even in an emergency. Fundamental rights are supposed to be stable and reliable, even if restricting them would further the greater good. And if states decide that it is necessary to restrict fundamental rights because of an emergency, there needs to be a democratically legitimate and legally secure process leading up to that decision, in order for citizens to be able to demand public accountability and prevent abuses of power later on. But even if we grant that isolated rights infringements are justifiable due to an emergency situation, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's obviously justifiable to scale this up to an infringement of everybody's privacy rights by implementing powerful, invasive technological tools that have major long-term systemic effects on society, particularly when private tech corporations are involved and are able to operate in a space that is still legally under-regulated. The fact alone that there is an emergency doesn't actually decisively solve the question of whether important rights can be infringed upon or not. An emergency doesn't mean that just anything goes. But suppose now that some tracing apps, such as the decentralized ones that we discussed before, won't end up violating fundamental rights, however we might define those rights. If that were the case, would there still be a problem with tracing apps? So it looks like if no rights are violated by a tracing app, no harm is done. Well, or is it? You might, of course, wonder, is there maybe a risk that the capabilities that governments and corporations develop in virtue of providing tracing apps to the general public that might pose a danger for citizens' fundamental rights in the future and might harm them then, even if a risk of harm doesn't eventuate right now? Now, there has been a lively philosophical debate in recent years on the ethics of risk and uncertainty, and I think it can help us understand what might be going on here. So beyond the risk of individual privacy infringements, there might be a risk of larger scale mission creep. Mission creep in this context would be defined as the gradual expansion of private data use beyond the originally defined purpose and beyond the domain of public health. So that could include law enforcement or insurance or advertising or some other domain. And so even if governments and corporations do not pursue bad goals initially via contact tracing apps, they might decide later on to hang on to their new big data enabled powers. Of course, you might think, well, a risk of harm isn't actually the same thing as a harm itself. A risk may or may not eventuate, so a mere risk itself seems fairly innocuous. So if no tangible harm results from a risk imposition, you might say, no harm, no foul. But I think that would be dangerously quick. After all, those who are exposed to risk often change their behavior, precisely in order to avoid a situation in which a risk eventuates in harm for them, and thereby affects them negatively. When we know that a risk of harm, such as a risk of our private data being used for an inappropriate purpose in the future, is looming over us, we might start choosing differently than we otherwise would. So mere risks can affect our ability to choose truly autonomously. What's more, exposure to risk can be experienced as an expression of disrespect. If a government is happy to make citizens bear significant risks, that might communicate that the rights of citizens that are at risk simply don't matter enough to stop imposing those risks. So for these reasons, imposing a mere risk on somebody could be wrongful, even if the risk doesn't actually eventuate in tangible harm. Now, while a risk of intrusive surveillance might be less bad than actual intrusive surveillance, that doesn't necessarily make the risk imposition entirely unobjectionable. So it's more like no harm, yes foul. But most importantly, we have to remember that risks aren't always distributed fairly in society. And even if risks are equally distributed, they might affect different persons and groups unequally. Patterns of vulnerability to risk often mirror and amplify patterns of racial, gender, and class injustice. Surveillance, data-driven law enforcement, and other exercises of government power affect marginalized communities more negatively than members of other, more privileged groups. As Princeton University professor Ruha Benjamin argues in her recently published book, Race After Technology, many different kinds of emerging technologies often translate into surveillance and control for some, and security and freedom for others. Those who are not generally the target of such practices can sleep soundly in the knowledge that such technologies are being used for the greater good, even as they extend incarceration outside jails and prisons and into the most intimate settings of everyday life. For me, the bottom line is it's going to be really, really important for us not to allow contact tracing tools to be susceptible to the kind of mission creep that enables mass surveillance with deeply unjust consequences. In order to harness the positive potential of tracing apps, that is what we should be focusing our efforts on. Now, interestingly, even back in the year 1932, the MIT Technology Review published the following text. The socially important aspect of the machine age is not the machines themselves. If the pathway to the future is in the hands of the engineer, then they have a very grave responsibility. It is not enough that they should produce new implements for people's desires. They must take a leading part in seeing to it that the new world which they are creating is a good sort of a place in which to live. Technological models and tools clearly reflect social facts and practices. They are not inherently neutral. Technology just doesn't inhabit a moral and political vacuum. So designing technology therefore means making very deliberate choices. And I think if we have an ability to choose, we also have a responsibility to choose well. Now, arguably, that's not only a responsibility of programmers and private companies, even though, of course, they have a huge responsibility in this area. I think more broadly, though, choosing well means choosing together as democratic citizens. So if we don't have democratic control over how powerful technologies like tracing apps affect our lives going forward, their use just won't be fully democratically legitimate. I think governments and also we collectively as democratic constituencies have to be ready to answer a number of tough but really important questions before deploying these tools. These are questions that, in my view, should be put on the democratic agenda rather than just being addressed only after we have deployed technological tools already in the real world. Now, one question for us to consider might be, which entities do we trust with the power to handle our data, and to what extent are we comfortable with the involvement of private corporations here? Also, how and where will data be stored, centralized or decentralized models, and when will it be deleted permanently? Is the app development process transparent? So can experts and other members of the public check an open source code base, or is there a publicly available impact assessment? And most importantly, have we actually adopted meaningful political and legal measures to prevent mission creep and ultimately an unjust distribution of risk in society?